Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Political Excess. Today, let's talk about some of the worst polling misses from this recent 2022 midterm election. So I've got 10 of these pulled up. They're just in alphabetical order, and it's only from Senate or governor's elections. I left out smaller races like the U.S. House because there's usually not many polls for those kinds of races. And I didn't have any specific set criteria for this. I'm just looking at polling in the aggregate to the final results. So I've got Wikipedia pulled up here, so let's go through this one by one. And I will say that most of the races that were very close, a lot of them did not go the way of the Republicans. Those aren't really on here because those were technically within the margin of error. And even though the Democrats won almost all of them, the polling misses on those were only 1, 2, or 3 points. And by now, most people know what those are. So I looked through all the races. These are the ones I think are the most off, and let's start here. Colorado governor. So Jared Polis, he won that, 58.5% of the vote. Heidi Ganahl, just over 39%. And while Polis was already expected to win this probably by a safe margin, 19 points, that's pretty much a landslide, and I didn't see it getting that high. And even though there's some deep red counties here along the perimeter of the state, and they're no match for that deep blue vote in Denver and surrounding counties. But if we go down here and look at the general election polling, there's different sources you can use here, but generally Polis was ahead by around 12 points here in the average. So the polls were off by more than 7 points. That's a pretty big miss. And if we go down here and look at the individual polls, there were a lot taken for this race. So it wasn't like there were only 2 or 3 and they were off by a lot. Every one of them did show Polis winning. That's not a surprise, but they did underestimate his support by around 5%, and they overestimated Heidi Ganahl's support by a few points as well. Now, Trafalgar, their name is going to come up a few times in this video. They showed it a 7-point race. Although they're a Republican-aligned pollster, they have had some success in prior elections, but in this particular midterm, they were much, much too favorable for the Republicans. But even a more reputable pollster like Emerson College, they underestimated Polis still by about 5%. Let's go on to the second race, and that is also for Colorado, but it's the U.S. Senate election there. And Michael Bennet, he won a third term. He got about 56% of the vote. Joe O'Dea cleared 41%. So as expected, Bennet underperformed Polis, and this is about a 14.5-point margin for Bennet. That is more than I expected. There might be a couple counties that Joe O'Dea won that Heidi Ganahl did not win. I haven't looked that far into it yet. But if we go down and take a look at the polling aggregate, that had Michael Bennet ahead about 7%, clearly underestimating Bennet and slightly overestimating O'Dea. I would guess those undecideds broke really heavy for Michael Bennet in the end. But if we go down and take a look at these individual polls, again, they all had Bennet winning, but pretty much all these did underestimate his support. Even Data for Progress, Democratic-aligned pollster, they had Bennet winning by only 7. But here's Trafalgar again. They showed it a 2-point race, 48 to 46 for Bennet. That is a colossal error, and that kind of a miss is going to damage their reputation. So for whatever reason, polls in Colorado, they are underestimating Democratic support. So these polling firms are going to have to make an adjustment to their model because we really can't be having these 7-point misses in the aggregate. Let's go on to the next one, and that is Florida governor. Of course, Ron DeSantis won that in a complete blowout, over 19 points for him. He got 59% of the vote to Charlie Crist's 40%. This is one of the few bright spots for Republicans. There's a lot of GOP shifts. There's a lot of deep red counties. DeSantis definitely won by more than I was expecting. Let's go down and take a look at the polling. This time in the aggregate, the average shows about a 12-point lead for DeSantis, so that's another 7-point miss. This time, it's in favor of the Democrats. If we look at the individual polls, none of them showed DeSantis getting in the high 50s. Nearly all of them showed him winning, except this Republican-aligned pollster. For whatever reason, the Political Matrix listener group, every one of their polls showed Charlie Crist with a lead. I've looked into that poll. I don't know why it's a Republican-aligned pollster. Every time their sample size greatly oversamples Democrats. And in their last poll, they showed Crist winning by 6 points. DeSantis won by over 19. That's a 25-point polling error. I mean, that's pretty much as bad as it could ever get. I can't imagine how they could possibly stay in business after that kind of an error. I don't even know how that's possible. But that firm is 100% useless. The rest of them underestimated DeSantis. And I don't really blame them because most of the time Florida does have relatively close elections. We're not used to these complete landslides. But we can also go on to the next one, and that is also for Florida, and that is the U.S. Senate election. Just like in Colorado, both of them underestimated one side. This time they underestimated Marco Rubio, the Republican. He did underperform Ron DeSantis as expected. He got close to 58% of the vote. Val Demings got over 41%. That's over a 14-point gap for Rubio. And if we look at these individual polls, they had Rubio ahead about 9 points. So that's more than a 6-point undercounting of Rubio's support. And the individual polls here, not much to say. Some of them were off by more than others, but they all did underestimate Rubio. The next race is for Michigan governor. This had Gretchen Whitmer winning re-election with 54.5% of the vote. Tudor Dixon got about 44%. That's about a 10.5-point gap. You can see here there are some blue counties here in the lower peninsula. Those should be red if Republicans wanted to win this race. Far too many light red counties, far too many blue counties, and Republicans, Tudor Dixon, lost this race by double digits. I did not think it would get that bad, but turns out it did. And if we go down to the polling, that had Gretchen Whitmer ahead by 3 to 4 points in the aggregate. So they greatly underestimated Whitmer's support, probably by about 7 to 8 points. And if we look at the individual polls, here's another bad one from Trafalgar that had Tudor Dixon actually winning it by 1 point. So again, Trafalgar is really going to have to make some adjustments because they weren't just off by 2 or 3 or 4 points. They were off by a ton. In this case, they thought it would go toward the Republicans, and it definitely did not. Now, some of these other polls actually did show a close race, though. It was low single digits. Even Emerson showed about a 5 to 6 point race for Whitmer. So there was a lot of blue vote out there that just was not being picked up by the polls. And on to the next state, and that is New Hampshire, U.S. Senate. Maggie Hassan won re-election with 53.5% of the vote. Don Bolduc got about 44.5%. That's a 9-point win for Hassan. Bolduc only won 2 counties. And if we go down to the individual polls, and this showed Hassan ahead by low single digits, about 2 to 3 points. It did seem like this was going to be a close race, but it turns out it wasn't really. And if we go down to the individual polls, these ones right before Election Day did show a close race, low single digits. There was a couple of tied polls, and even Trafalgar showed Bolduc ahead by 1 point again. So for whatever reason, the polls in New Hampshire greatly underestimating Democratic support. The next race is going to be Oklahoma governor, and that had Kevin Stitt winning re-election with 55.5% of the vote. Joy Hoffmeister got just under 42%. It's about a 13.5-point win for Stitt. He won almost all of the counties, as pretty much expected. The only question was, what was the margin going to be in Oklahoma City and in Tulsa? And I did think Hoffmeister was going to perform better here than she did. I thought she could get it down below double digits, but she didn't even get close, really. And if we go down to the polls here, that showed Kevin Stitt with about a 4.8% lead, according to 538 in the aggregate. Another case where the other or undecided voters went hard for the incumbent. And as for the individual polls, some of these are a little bit all over the place. A lot of these are Republican-aligned pollsters for whatever reason. One of them at the end even did show Hoffmeister with a lead. Emerson College, they also polled it. They still underestimated Kevin Stitt's support. And it turns out Kevin Stitt's own internal poll here from WPA Intelligence, that might have actually been the closest poll here toward the end. Usually that's not going to happen. An internal poll is probably going to be one of the most biased. Turns out this time it was probably the most accurate. And the next race will be Rhode Island governor, and that had Dan McKee winning election to a full term. He got about 58% of the vote. Ashley Kalus got 39%. That's a wide 19-point gap for McKee. There's very few counties in Rhode Island, but McKee won all of them. And if we go down and look at the polling, the problem here is there's so few polls. That's why this isn't overly beneficial. The last poll from early October showed Dan McKee with 46%, Ashley Kalus with 36%. That's a 10-point gap. So there must have been a lot of late movement in favor of McKee, the undecideds. They broke hard again for the incumbent. And I do wish there were more polls for Rhode Island. I don't know why there weren't. But let's move on to the next state, and that is governor of South Carolina. That had Henry McMaster winning re-election with 58% of the vote. Joe Cunningham got just under 41%. I'm a little surprised by this kind of a margin. I thought Joe Cunningham would do a little bit better, possibly even get it down below double digits, but he got wiped out. And this is more than a 17-point gap for McMaster. And if we take a look at the polling, similar to Rhode Island, there's not that many. That's a shame, but the ones that are on here showed Henry McMaster with way less support than he got, and Joe Cunningham his support was overestimated by a few points. Let's go on to one more of these, and that is U.S. Senate in Washington. And that one had Patty Murray winning re-election with over 57% of the vote. Tiffany Smiley got about 42.5%. That's about a 14.5-point gap. So all that talk about Washington maybe getting close, possibly there could be a flip if everything goes the Republicans' way. That didn't get close to happening. I did have a hard time believing it, but I thought it would get closer than this based on the few polls that I saw. Of course, Tiffany Smiley did really well in the eastern part of the state, but not well enough. There's still some light red counties out there. And if we check out the polling, the average here had Patty Murray with about a 4.3% lead. So they underestimate her support substantially by about 10 points. And the individual polls here, a couple of these toward the end actually showed a tied race. The other ones did show a low single-digit race. Some of them were mid-single digits. Probably the closest one here was Civics. They got it to about a 14-point gap, 55 to 41. So I'll give them some credit there. But I think the overall takeaway is the polling was a miss. Some polling firms did have a couple of hits here and there. Some of them were only off by 3 or 4. A lot of them had these misses by 5, 6, 8 points. And that's not going to help anyone feel confident in the polling in the next election. And again, in some of the closer races, Arizona, Nevada, those were generally off in favor of the Republicans, but not by 6 or 7 points. They were mostly off by 1 to 3 points. They just happened to break the way of the Democrats, so I did not want to include those. I also left out a few other states, Maine governor, Pennsylvania governor, and South Dakota governor. Those are a few other states that you might want to include in here, but these are the 10 that I included that I thought were probably off by the most in the aggregate. If you want to do a lot of research and find out which polling firm had the best accuracy and had the worst, you could do that. Probably getting on 538 would make that easier, as you can get all of one polling firm's polls in one place. But I don't know how much benefit that's going to be. A lot of these polls were off by just too much. I do think the mail-in voting can make things harder to gauge, especially if we're counting votes days or even longer after the election. But I think that's a little bit of a glance here at some of the polling from this recent midterm. Let me know in the comments, which polls do you think were the most or the least accurate? Were there any races that I missed? And do you think there were any upsets based on the polling this year? Let me know down below. And if you enjoy this channel, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Thank you for watching. I will see you on the next video.